Open your Bibles. We are going to be in the book of Hebrews this morning. The book of Hebrews. We are coming to a close very rapidly on a series that I started a number of weeks ago now. It's based on a book called The Reason for God by Tim Keller. And here is that. Do we have you operating both of those today, Nate? Let's see if you can get that for me. This is from Tim Keller, and this is his book. It's called The Reason for God. We are doing something very easy. Tim Keller, in his book, responds to 7 questions that skeptics have about faith or about the Christian faith. And we have covered 5 of those now, just 2 of them left. Maybe one of the most important ones I think we covered was, why does a loving God allow pain and suffering in the world? I hear that as a question offered a lot by people that are maybe not in faith, and they're saying, I don't get that. And so Keller sets up a number of those questions, and he answers those as best we can, and has this dialogue that we're creating with skeptics around us. 2 questions, like I said, remaining, and this one is a big one again today. And perhaps this is a big one today because of the area where we live. We live in a very tech-heavy area that cares a lot about science and technology. And so the question that we're going to cover today that skeptics would ask is, hasn't science disproved Christianity? You've heard people say something like that before. They might say, I don't believe in anything religious because, I follow science. Or they might say science and faith are not compatible. That's the way that they might put that. Perhaps the greatest quote comes from a USC professor. His name is T.C. Boyle, and this is the way he put it. Science has killed religion. And that's a pretty forward statement, but it kind of summarizes what many people would believe if they're deep into science, and it's almost as if science has become actually their God, but they would say, hey, there's a complete incompatibility between science and faith. The general feeling is, again, if you're a skeptic, that both of those can't exist simultaneously. You're either religious or you're scientific, but you can't be both at the same time. Our passage for today is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, and this is what it says. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. And so what is that passage saying to us? It's saying that we as Christians hold something very sacred, and that is that God created everything that we can see, all the material matter over all of the universe, and He created it out of nothing. And we're going to have a chance to explore that a little bit more. And I want to contend with you today that although most skeptics would say you can't be religious and scientific, I believe that is actually possible. And I want to try to prove that to you today, that we can hold both of those well and exercise both of those well for the glory of God. We're going to unpack in just a few minutes why some people in the scientific world would say that religions and science don't match. But I want to introduce you to 3 important scientists who over the course of history have had a very prominent role, and they have been Christians. I want to introduce them to you to prove to you, again, that you can be a Christian and a scientist. Number 1 on the list, Francis Bacon. Bacon was a Franciscan friar. He lived around 1250, and that is, by the way, right in the heart of the Middle Ages. So again, the dark ages of the world. And Francis Bacon is the guy who develops the scientific method. So he's the guy that says there is an empirical approach that we're going to take when we study things, and we're going to do it in a scientific way, and he is the developer of the scientific method. So the guy that actually puts science on the map is a Christian around 1250 AD. Fast forward to a little bit more of a modern person. This is Francis Collins. He is a scientist at the National Institute of Health, and he is also the head of the Human Genome Project. So again, the Human Genome Project studies the human DNA code, and it is sequencing or providing ways to understand the human genome code so that we can actually have better medicine and better things, ways of approaching our health. He is a guy that grew up in a family that was not a religious family, and he went to Yale University. He graduated, and he came out of Yale saying, I'm now an atheist. He was practicing as a doctor, and a woman he was treating was suffering from a lot of pain and what was an incurable disease. And she told the doctor, she said, you know what? I'm getting a lot of help and aid because I know my Lord. And so this is, providing some area of, solace for me, of comfort for me in the midst of all this. And she said, doctor, what do you believe about God? And he said, my face flushed, and I realized at that moment I did not have a good answer for her, and I had not really investigated it very deeply. And so he said, I went on a quest, and I went on a search. And where it all landed for me was that I was now a follower of Jesus. And this is his quote. He said, I now believe that the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. And so he says, I've got brand new desire and impetus for my research because I know God. One more, MIT professor Jing Kong, she's an electrical engineering PhD at MIT. She became a Christian as a grad student at UC Berkeley, and this is what she says. She says, my research is only a platform for me to do God's work. His creation, the way he made this world, is very interesting. It's amazing, actually. And so she says, I have also a new platform, a new way of looking at my world because I'm studying something that was put in motion by God, and that's a fuel for my work. Now, why do I bring these three people to you? Because faith and science were, in their worlds, completely a match. They were completely partnership, and they did not see those as two things that were separate at all, but one that complemented the other. And that's part of the contention I want to have with you today is I think we can be Christians that are like that. Christianity, over the centuries, has prized the life of the mind. We have not been afraid at all to have minds that think clearly. We do not want people to check their brains at the door. We have them bring their minds fully into faith, and we believe that, again, we have a faith which can articulate truth, and so we are people that hold that very high. All right, let's turn our sights now to what people mean when they say that science and the Christian faith don't match, or they might say science has disproved the Christian faith, and we're going to do some unpacking on that like we have in previous weeks. Really, there's fairly levels of nuance, or there's fairly level of aspects that we need to look at with that. And today I want to show you three possible things that skeptics mean when they say that science has disproved Christian faith. The first area that they would say that about is miracles. And even a cursory reading of the Bible shows you that there are miracles in the Bible. In fact, perhaps the biggest miracle of all is the resurrection of Jesus. You cannot be a Christian unless you believe that Jesus rose from the dead. It's one of the foundational tenets of our faith. And nearly every book of the Bible has some aspect of the miraculous in it. The Gospels are no different. The Gospels record part of Jesus' life. He's out doing ministry, and he is healing people. He's feeding 5,000 people miraculously. He's walking on water. I mean, there's all these things that Jesus is doing that are very miraculous things. And so it's right when skeptics say, we read the Scriptures and we see miracles there. Some skeptics would say that those are a bunch of just wives' tales. There's no evidence for miracles, they would say. Some would go as far as to say that science has actually proven that miracles cannot happen. Let's slow down for just a minute because I want to talk for a second about what science is and what science is not. Science is based upon the scientific method. You remember Francis Bacon. We just learned about him a minute ago. He's the guy that puts in motion. This is the framework for science. Science is based upon a hypothesis in which there's an empirical approach, there's an experiment, and then there's a level of repeated results. I can go and do an experiment today, and it will have the same results tomorrow if I have the same level of controls around that experiment. If any of us have been a part of a high school chemistry class, you know about this scientific method or this empirical method. Because you go set up your experiment, you control it, and then you record your results inside of a little book in order to say, all right, I did the test, and these are the results that came out of it. However, what about things that cannot be tested? For instance, what about love? How would we develop a test to show love? I mean, beyond maybe chocolates and flowers. I mean, maybe that's a test. I don't know. But how would we go about trying to say we're going to test love? Or second, how about things that are repeatable, but things that are not repeatable? For instance, when we test gravity, it's always operating the same way, at least on Earth, and it's always going to give us the same result because gravity is a constant. But what about things that only occur occasionally or even rarely, and they don't submit themselves to testing? For instance, how would you develop a test to prove that Abraham Lincoln lived? I don't know of a test that would actually do that, or a test that you could actually repeat and demonstrate something like that, because that's something in the past. He doesn't exist anymore, and so I don't know how you would develop a test around that. How would we do things or test for things that are non-repeatable or actually in the category, again, of the miraculous? Because those things by their very nature are non-repeatable. Those things by their very nature break the rules. Those things by their very nature don't follow a normal pattern. We don't necessarily see people rising from the dead repeatedly all the time, but we still hold that Jesus did that, and that was a miracle from the past. So my point in saying that is science has its limits. There are some things that science cannot answer. Some things it's not equipped to answer. Some people have rightly said that science is well equipped to answer the what and the how, but oftentimes not the why. Think about this with me. Let's say I hiked to the top of Mount Rainier, and I was really proud of that hike. Science would be able to tell you how high I am on Mount Rainier, how long it took me to get up there, how many steps it took me to get up there, but science could not answer this fundamental question: why did I hike up the mountain? It's not equipped for that. It can't get to that level of why. And so science has its limits, and it's important to recognize that, especially when we start talking again about an area of miracles. They can't prove that miracles didn't happen. They can be skeptical about that, but there's no proof for that because it doesn't submit itself to the scientific method or approach. All right. The second area where skeptics would say that science and faith don't match is in the area of creation. And by that, I mean the way that the world was formed. Skeptics would say that the creation story of Genesis 1 and 2 that claim a six-day creation doesn't match with their view of the world that developed over billions and billions of years. The relationship of science to the Bible hinges not only on the way that we look at the scientific record, but also for the way that we interpret key passages of the Bible, Genesis 1 being one of those. Now, Christians have held a variety of views related to science in the Bible. My goal today is not to adjudicate all those different views. Today I'm studying the story of creation, or talking with you about the story of creation, and I'm not talking about it kind of down in the weeds. I'm staying kind of up at the 50,000 foot level today. I've studied Genesis 1 and 2 down in the weeds, believe me, and I have the ability to do that, but that's not what we're doing today. We're talking about it in much broader strokes, and so we're going to have a chance to talk about that in just a moment. Before we look at the key arguments related to the creation story, I want to introduce you a framework that was developed by Ian Barber, and this is a framework about how Christians would interact with science. And I'm hoping this is helpful for you as we talk about some of the other things we're discussing today beyond creation, other topics. This is his chart or his framework. He says that there at the top is what we would say is incompatibility or compatibility between science and faith. And on the other poles is differences or similarities. And so the one that has the highest level of heat around it would be the one that says there is incompatibility in science and faith, and there are differences that are very great. That would be the upper right-hand corner, and it's called the conflict model. And it would say there is basically warfare because the other side is completely wrong. And honestly, probably among Christians, the ones that we hear the most from are the ones that say there is just conflict between science and faith. And so again, that's the upper right-hand quadrant. Down at the bottom quadrant, it's called the independence model, and it basically says there's no connection between the two at all. They talk about two completely different things. Faith is predominantly a very subjective and inward area of life, And so we just leave those two as like two separate poles. We don't even try to merge them. That would be the bottom right-hand quadrant. The upper left-hand quadrant says there is a level of dialogue that we can have because both are true as long as they are kept in their separate areas. So both have strengths, but we're going to both keep them separate in order to find out what those strengths are. And then in the bottom left-hand corner is the integration model. Both can work together for a more complete picture. Obviously, there are some caveats to that, but they would say, we have a level or a desire here to see if they can work together. I encourage you to consider that because, again, as we're coming to some of these topics, you're probably going to fall into one of those areas. You're probably going to have one way that you approach faith and science, and that is a helpful model for us to get to that. All right, with that in mind, and that as a backdrop, it's time to now look at the creation story. And remember that for the most part, skeptics would say that the biblical story does not match the way that they look at science. Genesis chapter 1 is where we're going to begin. And again, I'm not going to read all of Genesis 1 for you, but I have here just the first portion of it. It says this, first words of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So again, this is day number 1 of the writing of what this 7-day period looks like of God creating all of the world. Did you know that there's actually 2 stories in the Bible of the creation? This is one of them, all through Genesis chapter 1, and there's a second one that's in Genesis chapter 2. And you might say, why are there 2 different stories? Well, it's as if the author of Genesis said, I'm going to take and focus in very tightly. I'm going to take the camera and I'm going to really tighten the lens, and I'm going to look at something in the second story that was only hinted at in the first story. So the second story focuses in on the creation of Adam and Eve, the creation of man and woman, and their placement in a perfect garden. And so it's as if God's saying something. He's saying, out of everything that I've created, this is the part I really want to tell you about, is I've created somebody in my likeness, and I want to tell you about the creation of people. In very broad strokes, Christians, as they interpret these events, fall into 2 camps. Let me tell you these 2 camps today. The 2 camps are what's called an old earth thinking, or a new earth, or a young earth thinking. If you are a young earth theologian, then you would believe that the Bible is literal, as it's talking in Genesis 1 about God creating in days, and days are exactly like we have days today. And you would say that everything that happened is going to, that we see recorded, is going to happen roughly about 6,000 years ago. And so you're going to be a young earth person saying, all the events, probably, you have the creation, and then you have the flood, and that's the point at which obviously things change. And so again, that's the framework that you're operating by. If you are an old earth theologian, then you would say there's a rather poetic expression of Genesis chapter 1, and there are some things that God chose actually not to put there that happened. And so there's, again, something that maybe happened even before we see the creation of man, because maybe those days are not literal days, but they're periods or epochs of time. And so there's things that are happening that God says, I'm not choosing to necessarily put in my poetic expression of the world. Again, today, I'm not adjudicating those 2 views, so don't hear me saying I'm choosing one over the other. I'm only telling you that both of those exist. And I'm also telling you this. They're not salvific. You are not going to get to heaven, and God says, you're out of heaven because you had the wrong view of Genesis chapter 1, all right? It doesn't work that way. He's going to ask you one question. Do you know Jesus? And are you trusting Jesus for your salvation? That's what the question is going to be asked. So this is, again, important. I'm not diminishing its importance, but it's not to the level of salvation. So I'm calling you to be good students of the Word, but realize there are people that are a lot smarter than all of us in this room, spend a lot of time on this, and they fall in different areas in that way. All right, when we bring up creation, there's usually something that comes up, and it always comes up around this idea of creation. And the 2 things that come up is dinosaurs and the revolving of the sun around the earth. Not the earth around the sun, but the opposite way. let's talk about both of those for a moment. Our kids are usually introduced to dinosaurs around elementary school, and they are exhibit 1 of the evolutionary framework, all right? So again, dinosaurs are a part of, again, the whole rubric of evolution. In general, if you're a young Earth thinker, then dinosaurs existed within that 6,000 year period, and basically dinosaurs are wiped out by the flood. That's where you fall. If you're an old Earth person, then you believe that Genesis 1, again, is more poetic, and so dinosaurs existed before man, but they are in a period of time that's kind of nondescript, and days, again, are not necessarily literal days, but they're periods of time within the Scripture. Here's what Scott Hubbard, managing editor of Desiring God, says. He says, I won't mind much. He's got 2 sons, by the way. I won't mind much whether my son embraces a young Earth or an old Earth view of creation. I will mind greatly whether he sees dinosaurs, and indeed all of the earth, in relation to the God who made them. And the most important lesson dinosaurs teach, it seems to me, has little to do with the age of their bones, whether they lived in the Mesozoic era or the days of Noah. Much remains the same. Many were fierce, many were fantastical, all of them were created by God. And so again, that's what, again, for our children, I'm hoping we're teaching them, whether we're teaching them where dinosaurs existed in biblical times, we're at least saying this: God created everything that we see, and whether you're young Earth or you're old Earth, you agree on that topic. All right, there's one more. Skeptics raised the question about the orientation of the earth and the sun, and it's clear that, again, most people before around 1250 believed that the earth was flat. Copernicus and Galileo were the individuals who brought forth the heliocentric model of the world, and they went against everything that was up to that time thought about the world, and they said, oh, on the contrary, the sun is not passing over the earth, but the earth is passing around the sun, and it's forming this period of time in which there is a year pattern of the earth going around the sun. And they used some very sophisticated models for the time to display and prove that. And here's what I want to tell you. God's word is compatible with that. It has language in it that is going to talk about the idea that, again, we are somehow subject to these stellar constellations that are around us, and they're created by God. Now, again, there would be individuals who are skeptics, and they would say, oh, but on the contrary, there are passages in the Scripture that seem to indicate that the sun is going over the earth. Here's one of them. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 5. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. And there are other passages in the Scriptures just like that. And so I ask you the question, as Ecclesiastes, the writer of Ecclesiastes says that, does he mean, I'm telling you something scientific right now, and I'm telling you that the sun is going over the earth? I don't think that is his point. His point is that the sun is coming in a very predictable cycle. There's order to our creation. There's a repetitive and dependable nature to the patterns in which God has created, and it's telling us something about the stability and control of God. And so the passages in the Scriptures, I don't think predominantly are making a scientific statement as much as they are a statement about the character of God and the character of earth. God's word is completely compatible with what we see in the Scriptures and in the universe. And as Christians, we believe that at the foundation, God has created everything. And that seems to be what is in the Genesis story. God is the original creator. And whether you're a young earth or old earth Christian, you are holding that to be, again, your touchstone. One thing is clear, Genesis is not predominantly concerned with science. If it were, it would express accounts that would be teeming with formulas and scientific explanations. But the God who made the universe is the God who created scientific knowledge, and his scientific knowledge is surpassing ours. And so the lack of scientific detail is not an oversight, but rather a deliberate prioritization of what God wants us to know. And he wants us to know about these people that he's created, why we're here, and why we're in relationship with God. There's a third area that skeptics bring up about why science and religion are not compatible. But before we get there, this week in my study, I had some really fun in finding out some things that people say about, again, creation and evolution and all the things that relate to that. And these are a couple of the little film clips that I saw. The evolution of synchronized swimmers. I thought that one was quite good. The next one. No, first you have to evolve into a man, then you can have a man cave. And then this one. If evolution really works, how come mothers only have 2 hands? And I thought that one was exceptionally good also. The third aspect of skeptics' claim that science and faith don't match is this word, evolution. And I wish I had a nickel for every time somebody said, I believe in evolution and therefore I don't have any faith, or I don't believe in religion. Charles Darwin was the founder of the evolutionary theory. Darwinian theory is the leading theory that's taught in schools. If you're a part of a high school, you're probably learning about evolution at some level. If you're certainly in college, that's the framework by which everything is being taught and explored. And the Bible does have something to say about the creation of animals. We hold the Bible in high regard, and so we want to take this very seriously. Genesis chapter 1, a little bit later in the story, chapter 1, verse 24, and God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. The livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And so God is telling us something here. I'm the creator of all things alive, whether they be plants or animals. And in the animal world, I'm creating things according to their kind. They have certain categories, as it were. And this comes long before the human categorization at all of species and phylum and orders and all those things that are scientific terms today. God says, I created everything according to its kind. Now, when we come to the issue of evolution, we kind of ask the question, well, what do we mean? And evolution has a couple of dimensions to it that I want to draw out today. The 2 dimensions I want to draw out today is that there is microevolution and macroevolution. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. They're not my terms. They're actually terms used in science today. Microevolution suggests, as its name suggests, is that there's evolutionary change at a very small scale. It's occurring among maybe a single gene and in a single population over a very short period of time. The classic example of this is the peppered moth. I think that is in England. And the peppered moth exists in 2 varieties. It exists in a light variety and a dark variety. And that's a natural mutation that happened over time. The 2 of those exist. In generation number 1, you'll see that there's more white moths than black moths. And that's because they have a better camouflage against the trees and the areas where they are hiding. And so it's easier to find the dark moths, and that's what animals will go and get. Birds will swoop down and find the dark ones faster. But imagine if there is something that's a factory nearby, it's producing soot now, and the soot is covering over much of that flora and fauna. And so now, somehow the environment has changed, and so now birds are able to find the dark moths less easy than the light moths. And so in generation 2, you'll notice that the light moths begin to decrease and the dark moths begin to increase. And by the time you get to generation number 3, the predominance of dark moths is higher than the predominance of light moths. Now, again, this is classic. This is right out of a textbook. I think I even learned this in my science class in high school. So this is a long time ago. Some of you are nodding your heads like, yeah, I remember that one. We, as Christians, have really little problem with this. We actually have witnessed things like that have happened. And there's a species that has small changes that occur over time, and there's natural selection, again, a Darwinian word, and we would say, you know what, we get that, and we don't have a problem in watching that occur. That's called microevolution. But when it comes to macroevolution, there's a big difference, because macroevolution says that there's a large-scale change, and it occurs over a longer period of time. And it's basically saying that one species can turn into another species. And here's the problem with that. We just don't have a whole lot of examples of that happening. Now, there might be people that claim that is happened, but they're just few and far between. For instance, the idea of a fish becoming a bird. That is something that we would have a lot of difficulty in just seeing that's happened in the record. And so while Christians can't necessarily get behind microevolution, we can get behind, they get behind microevolution, we can't get behind macroevolution because, again, it doesn't seem to match, A, with the biblical record, but it also doesn't seem to match with much of the scientific record. When evolution is turned into an all-encompassing theory explaining absolutely everything we believe, feel, and do as a product of natural selection, then that is not in the area of science anymore, but in the area of philosophy or in the area of faith. Evolution, as an all-encompassing theory, has some insurmountable difficulties as a worldview. Science radically fails when it begins to answer some of the philosophical questions because, A, it's not equipped to do that, and B, it just doesn't have the framework to be able to uphold that. And so we have to have a level of skepticism of whether or not it's able to act, as it were, as a full faith or a religion. All right, let's bring this plane into land. By the way, let me just say this real quickly before I close. I realize today there are some of you that are very learned on this subject, and you might have a disagreement with me, and that's okay. I'm doing the best I can to take some very complex things and boil them down for us today, but I have no problems if you want to have a conversation past this, and you may educate me in some ways. I'm not saying I've got all of this all dialed in, but I'm doing my best job on this topic today. So let's bring the plane in for a landing. I want to close with Albert Einstein. This is what Einstein says: science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Einstein, obviously one of the greatest scientists of our time, said we need both. This is the way that Tim Keller ends this chapter of his book. He says, we should have a lot of understanding that anytime we start talking about miracles and we start talking about the way God does things, that makes us uncomfortable because there's things there that we're not used to seeing. And so again, we have to have a level of understanding for ourselves and others who are trying to grapple with that. He takes everybody by the hand in his book and goes to Matthew chapter 28. And he says, this was the disciples, the last chapter of the book of Matthew, and they go to watch Jesus ascend to heaven. And this is the way that it records that. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. What? Record scratch. These are the apostles. These are the guys. How could it be that some worshiped, but others doubted? And he says, right here, baked into the record of the Bible for us, is some people that are like, I've just watched this, or I think I've seen this with my eyes, but I don't know if I even believe what I'm seeing with my eyes, and so they have a level of doubt. He says this: we might get the idea that we're this modern group of people, and so we're so far ahead of anybody in the past. And he says, this is what I want you to see. The people in the past, which we would obviously think are archaic, struggled in some of the same areas we do in saying, how do we make sense of this world that we see, the order that we see, and God breaking into it in some very fantastical ways. This should also give all of us pause, because there are some of us, like the early church, who are going to take a little bit more time to digest some of this. And so we are patient with each other. Friends, here's where I want to end today. The church needs fantastic theologians, and the church needs fantastic scientists. And we hope that there is a blend between those two worlds in order for us to fully follow God together, and that there's a handshaking in the middle. Father, thank you again for your word and for you equipping us to wade into our world and to engage with real questions like this one today. Lord, as we live in this tech area of our world, I'm praying, Lord, that you sharpen us even more to have responses that are wholesome and good and winsome to those friends around us that are asking questions about science and faith. Thank you for your word and its stellar nature. It's never going to end, and we affirm that today about you also.